The room behind the loading dock smelled like machine oil and burnt coffee. Emily Turner set the folder on the table, her hand not quite steady. Ryan Dawson. Effective immediately. He didn't argue. He read the page once, folded it in half, and looked up at her. You sure you want your name on that? She signed anyway. Ink barely dry. Ryan stood, picked up his phone, and dialed a number no one at Prescott Logistics had ever heard him say out loud. The clock on the wall read 2:14. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "Do it now." Before the reason behind that phone call becomes clear, ask yourself this: what would you do in the first hour after losing a job you'd never fully explained to anyone? That morning had started like any other. 6:30, Tulsa still dark outside the kitchen window, and Ryan Dawson stood at the stove flipping pancakes while his daughter Grace sat at the counter swinging her feet against the stool legs. She was 9, missing a tooth on the bottom row, and she had a habit of asking questions in the middle of eating. Did Mom like pancakes? Ryan didn't flinch. He never did, not anymore, not after 3 years of learning how to answer without letting his voice catch. She liked the ones with blueberries better. Said mine were too plain. Are these plain? These are for you. You don't like blueberries. Grace grinned around a mouthful and let it go, the way kids did when they'd gotten enough of an answer to feel steady again. Ryan watched her a second longer than he needed to, then packed her lunch and drove her to school before heading to the Prescott Logistics warehouse on the east side of the river, where he'd worked the maintenance floor for going on 4 years. Nobody at Prescott knew much about him beyond that he could fix almost anything with a belt or a bearing in it, that he kept to himself, and that he never once complained about a double shift. He wore the same gray jacket most days. He ate lunch alone, usually with a paperback in his hand. If you'd told the forklift crew that the quiet guy from maintenance held any kind of power over their jobs, they'd have laughed. Across town, in a glass office on the 9th floor of Prescott's regional headquarters, Emily Turner was not laughing. She was 33 years old, 2 years into the VP of Operations title, and she was staring at a spreadsheet that Gary Pruitt had sent her that morning with a note attached: trim 12% from warehouse headcount by Friday. Start with Dawson. She'd read the note twice, looking for a reason attached to the name and finding none. Ryan Dawson had no disciplinary file. No complaints. If anything, his file had 3 separate commendations for catching equipment failures before they became accidents. She'd gone to Gary's office to ask why. Does it matter? Gary had said, not looking up from his monitor. He was 51, built like a man who'd once played college football and never quite let the shoulders go, and he had a way of making a room feel smaller just by staying seated in it. We need the number. He's on the list. He's one of the best guys we've got on that floor. Then he'll land somewhere else. Get it done today. Emily had stood there a moment, folder in hand, feeling the particular kind of stuck that came with knowing you were the one who'd carry the weight of someone else's decision. She'd walked to the warehouse instead of calling him in. She told herself it was more respectful, face to face. Maybe it was. Maybe it just made her feel less like a coward. By the time she reached the small office behind the loading dock, Ryan was already there, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, like he'd been expecting bad news his whole life and had simply been waiting for it to arrive on schedule. Ryan didn't go home after he left the loading dock. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long moment, the phone heavy in his hand, and then he called a number saved under 2 letters only, DC. David Coleman picked up on the second ring, the way he always did when that particular contact lit up his screen. David was 62, a trust attorney who'd represented the Dawson family for over 20 years, and the only person outside of one retired board chairman who knew the truth sitting underneath Ryan's gray maintenance jacket. They fired you, David said. Not a question. 12 minutes ago. Who signed it? Emily Turner. VP of Ops. She didn't want to. I could tell. David exhaled, the sound of a man rubbing his eyes. Ryan, you know what happens if I move on this. I know. Here was the part nobody at Prescott Logistics understood, because nobody at Prescott Logistics was supposed to understand it. Ryan's father had built Prescott from 3 trucks and a rented lot in 1989. When he passed, controlling ownership hadn't gone to Ryan directly, it had gone into a holding entity called Meridian Point Partners, a name that appeared nowhere on Ryan's employment paperwork, a name that meant nothing to anyone in human resources who'd run a background check on a maintenance technician named Ryan Dawson. Only David, and only the trust documents locked in his office safe, connected Meridian Point to the Dawson family, and through Meridian Point, to Ryan. Buried in Prescott's corporate bylaws, in a section almost nobody read past the first paragraph, sat a clause David himself had drafted the year Ryan stepped back from the company. Any individual holding board observer status under the family trust could not be terminated by any officer below the level of chief executive without formal board review. Ryan had accepted that status quietly, years ago, back when leaving the executive floor had felt like the only way to keep breathing. That had been 3 years ago. The year his wife Laura died. Laura Dawson had been Prescott's internal safety inspector, sharp-eyed and stubborn about things other people wanted to let slide. She'd flagged the compressor system in Warehouse 3 twice in writing, both times overruled by budget decisions she wasn't in the room for. The accident that killed her had been ruled equipment failure. Nobody outside David's office had ever seen her original memos. Ryan had left the executive floor within a month of the funeral. He told the board he needed distance. What he hadn't told anyone was that he needed to be on that floor himself, wrench in hand, close enough to see if anything like it could happen again. I can freeze his approval authority and his system access in about 35 minutes, David said now. Emergency trustee authorization, no board vote needed for that part. But a for-cause termination, that takes a full board review. Evidence. I can't manufacture that overnight. Ryan looked at the photo of Laura still tucked in his wallet, worn soft at the corners. Do it. The freeze. But don't tell him yet. Why not just end it clean? Because if he doesn't know, he keeps talking. And I want to hear what he says when he thinks nobody's watching. David was quiet a beat. 2:49. That's when it goes live. Across town, Emily sat in her car in the Prescott parking garage, engine off, both hands on the wheel. She called down to the warehouse floor manager, a woman named Patricia who'd worked under her for 2 years. I need you to know I fought that one, Emily said. It didn't matter. I'm sorry. You don't owe me an apology, Emily. You're not the one who wrote the list. Feels like I am. My name's the one on the form. Patricia didn't answer right away, and in that silence Emily understood something she hadn't wanted to admit yet, that being the one who signed the paper and being the one who wrote the order were not the same thing, but from where the fired man stood, they probably looked exactly alike. At 2:49 that afternoon, somewhere inside a server room on the 4th floor of Prescott's headquarters, Gary Pruitt's approval authority quietly stopped working. His login still let him in. His badge still opened doors. But every request that touched personnel files or system-level changes now routed through a silent hold, invisible unless someone went looking for it. Gary didn't go looking. He had no reason to. By late afternoon, word of Ryan's firing had moved through the warehouse the way word always did, fast and mostly wrong. Half the floor thought he'd been caught stealing. The other half remembered the time, 18 months back, when a compressor line had started shrieking 2 minutes before it would have blown, and Ryan had been the one who'd cleared the floor and shut it down before anyone got hurt. Nobody who remembered that could make the theft story stick. Gary walked the floor that evening the way he always did after a hard decision, hands in his pockets, nodding at people like a man checking that his authority still held. When a young forklift operator asked, loud enough for others to hear, why the best mechanic on the floor had gotten cut with no warning, Gary smiled thin and said budgets didn't ask permission from anybody's feelings. Nobody pushed further. Gary had a way of making the next question feel like a mistake before you'd finished asking it. Emily saw it from the mezzanine office and, for the first time in 2 years working under him, she didn't nod along. She went back to her desk and pulled the maintenance history for Warehouse 3 instead, the file Laura Dawson had once flagged, though Emily didn't know that name yet, didn't know anything about who had written those original notes. All she saw were 2 entries where the dates looked wrong, like someone had gone back and smoothed something over after the fact. She sat with that a long moment, then locked her office door before she kept reading. Ryan picked Grace up from school at 3:30 like he always did, and when she asked why he was home before 5, he told her the truck needed work and he'd taken the afternoon. It wasn't quite a lie. It also wasn't the truth. Grace accepted it the way 9-year-olds accept most things adults tell them, with a shrug and a question about dinner. Patricia called that night too, after Grace had brushed her teeth and gone quiet down the hall. "Whole floor's talking," she said. "Nobody believes the reason they were given. People keep asking me if you're all right. Tell them I'm fine." "Are you?" Ryan looked at the dark window over the sink, his own reflection faint against the yard outside. "Ask me again in a week." Later, after she'd gone to bed, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him, waiting. When it buzzed, it was David. "Boards agreed to convene," David said. "Full review, in person, in a few days." "I need more than the bylaw violation, Ryan. I need something that shows cause. Otherwise this looks like a family trust throwing its weight around to protect one guy, and that's not a fight we automatically win, even with the clause on our side. Then we find the cause. We will. But it takes time. Days, maybe a week." Ryan looked toward the hallway where Grace's door sat cracked open, a small light still glowing from inside. "I've waited 3 years for something to change in that warehouse," he said. "I can wait a week." The IT request Emily filed the next morning came back denied within the hour, no explanation attached beyond a note that said the original maintenance logs were archived and unavailable pending a system migration. She'd worked at Prescott long enough to know when a denial had a person's fingerprints on it rather than a policy's. She just didn't know whose yet. That evening she drove to the address listed in Ryan's old employee file, telling herself the whole way that she wasn't doing anything more than what any decent manager would do, closing the loop, in person, on a decision that had never sat right. She almost turned around twice. Ryan answered the door in a t-shirt with an unreadable logo, sleeves of grease still faintly visible on his forearms even after washing. He looked surprised to see her, though not unkind about it. "Ms. Turner. Emily's fine. I know this is strange. I wanted to apologize in person. What happened yesterday, you didn't deserve that, and I want you to know I said so." He studied her a second, the way a man studies something he's deciding whether to trust. "You didn't have to drive out here to tell me that." "No. I didn't." Neither of them moved to end the conversation. From somewhere behind him, a small voice called out, "Dad, who is it?" And a moment later Grace appeared at his side, hair still damp from a bath, studying Emily with the frank curiosity only children manage without seeming rude. "This is Ms. Turner. She works with me. Worked with me." Grace considered this information the way she considered most new facts, turning it over once before setting it down. "You look nicer than the lady on the phone he was mad at yesterday." "Grace. What? She does." Emily laughed before she could stop herself, and something in Ryan's shoulders loosened for the first time since she'd arrived. It was small. It didn't fix anything. But it sat there between them a moment, warm and unexplainable, before she said her goodbyes and drove home with the radio off the whole way, unsure why she couldn't stop thinking about a 9-year-old's blunt approval. Gary noticed the IT request the next day, flagged automatically to his desk because it touched an old personnel file, and it put a small crease of suspicion in him that hadn't been there before. He didn't know what Emily was looking for. He only knew she was looking, and men like Gary did not care for people who looked without asking permission first. He said nothing to her directly. He simply made a note, the way he'd made notes for 4 years about which employees paid too much attention to the wrong files, and filed it away for later, the same drawer where Laura Dawson's original memos had gone to die 3 years earlier. That night, standing at his kitchen window with a coffee going cold in his hand, Ryan watched Emily's taillights disappear down the street and found himself thinking, not for the first time, about how a person could spend 2 years signing off on decisions she didn't agree with and still somehow keep enough of herself intact to drive across town and knock on a stranger's door to say she was sorry. It wasn't nothing. He wasn't sure yet what it was. Tony Reyes had worked the loading dock at Prescott for a year and a half, 24 years old, saving for community college classes he took 2 at a time between shifts. 6 weeks before Ryan got fired, a pallet jack with a known hydraulic fault had nearly taken off 2 of Tony's fingers, and the maintenance request he'd filed afterward had disappeared into the same silence that seemed to swallow every safety complaint at that warehouse. After that, Tony started keeping his own record. Nothing dramatic, just a habit of turning his phone camera on whenever a supervisor started talking about equipment in a tone that suggested the truth was about to get bent. He told himself it was for his own protection, in case something happened and Prescott tried to say it was his fault. David called Ryan on a Thursday morning with an update. Board set for next week. I've got the bylaw violation locked down tight, no way around it legally. But if we walk in with nothing but a technicality, Gary spins it as the family trust flexing muscle to protect its own. We need cause. Real cause. Working on it, Ryan said, though in truth he had no idea from where cause might come. Emily texted him that same week, nothing important, just a photo of a repaired stretch of guardrail near the loading dock with the caption "Fixed it myself, don't tell maintenance." Ryan sent back a single word, "Impressive," and found himself smiling at his phone in a way that felt unfamiliar after 3 years of mostly not smiling at anything on a screen. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be. Small things, passed back and forth without weight attached to them, had a way of becoming their own kind of language. Emily, unaware of any of this, kept building her own case in the quiet hours after her official work ended, cross-referencing invoices against maintenance logs, watching 2 years of small numbers that individually meant nothing and collectively meant a great deal. She didn't know yet that a man named Tony Reyes existed. She didn't know that her path and Ryan's path and a 9-year-old's approval of a stranger at the door were all bending, slowly, toward the same room. Gary, for his part, remained convinced that whatever Emily was digging for, it would lead nowhere useful, and that whatever fallout Ryan Dawson's firing had stirred up on the warehouse floor would settle the way it always settled, with time, and with enough quiet threats scattered across enough conversations that people learned not to ask twice. It was that overconfidence that undid him. Standing near the loading dock on a Tuesday afternoon, phone to his ear, Gary gave an instruction to a warehouse manager he trusted to follow orders without asking why. Pull the 2022 and 2023 safety files. All of them. I want them gone by end of day, not archived, gone. He hadn't noticed Tony 15 feet away, headphones in, phone propped against a stack of crates, recording nothing in particular, the way he'd taken to doing most afternoons out of habit rather than intent. The habit caught Gary's voice anyway, clean and unmistakable, ordering the destruction of records 2 full years wide. Tony sat with the recording for 2 full days before he did anything with it. He played it back more than once, telling himself it probably meant nothing, that maybe there was a boring explanation for a man ordering years of safety files destroyed on a Tuesday afternoon. But he kept coming back to Ryan, kept remembering the way Ryan had shut down that compressor line 18 months ago before anyone got hurt, the way he'd once spent his lunch break rewiring the pallet jack that had almost taken Tony's fingers, no paperwork, no charge, just because it needed doing. Tony didn't owe Prescott loyalty. He owed Ryan one. He found Emily instead of Gary, on instinct more than plan, catching her in the parking garage on her way to her car. "Ms. Turner. Can I show you something? I don't know who else to give this to." What followed left Emily standing beside her car for a full 10 minutes without moving, headphones in, the recording playing twice through. Gary's voice, unmistakable, ordering the destruction of 2 years of safety files. And beneath that, once Tony walked her through what he understood of the older records, a name she hadn't expected to hear again so soon, Laura Dawson, safety inspector, whose written warnings about the Warehouse 3 compressor system had been filed and, apparently, quietly buried, months before an equipment failure had killed her. Emily's hands went cold around the phone. She thought about a 9-year-old girl with damp hair asking who was at the door. She thought about a man who never talked about his past, who kept his sleeves rolled down even in July. She didn't call Ryan first. She went straight to Gary's office, knocked once, and walked in before he could answer. "You buried her reports," Emily said. No preamble. Laura Dawson's safety flags on the Warehouse 3 compressor. "You buried them, and 3 months later she died because of the exact thing she warned you about." Gary's face didn't move much, which told her more than any reaction could have. "You need to be very careful about accusations like that, Emily. I have a recording of you ordering the destruction of 2 years of safety files 4 days ago. I'm not being careless. I'm being precise." For the first time since she'd started working under him, Emily watched something flicker behind Gary's composure, not fear yet, but the beginning edge of it, the look of a man recalculating how much room he had left to maneuver. He told her to get out of his office in a voice gone quieter and harder than usual. She left, but she didn't feel small walking out. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely awake. She called Ryan from the stairwell, voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been even at their first meeting. "I know about your wife," she said. "I know what he did. I'm sorry, not just for the firing. For all of it. For not seeing it sooner." Ryan was quiet on the other end long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, simply, "Thank you for telling me instead of burying it too. What happens now?" "Now I call David again. And this time I tell him we have cause." Emily sat down on the stairwell steps, phone still pressed to her ear, in no hurry to end the call even after there was nothing left to say. Down the hall behind Gary's closed door, she could hear him already on his own phone, voice pitched low and fast in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not the voice of a man in control, but of one starting, for the first time, to feel the floor shift underneath him. Gary spent that evening making calls of his own, to a lawyer he kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation, asking questions about what an internal recording could and couldn't be used for, how fast a board review could realistically move, whether there was still time to get ahead of whatever was coming. The lawyer's answers weren't the ones he wanted. Gary hung up and sat alone in his office long after the rest of the floor had gone dark, running numbers on a legal pad that no longer added up in his favor. The board convened in a conference room on the top floor of Prescott's headquarters 2 days later, 9 members seated around a table of dark wood, David Coleman at the head with a folder thick enough to need both hands. Gary walked in expecting a routine quarterly review. He stopped mid-step when he saw who sat at the far end of the table, not as a guest, but in the chair marked, in small type on the seating card, Board Observer, Meridian Point Partners. Ryan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Watching the recognition land on Gary's face was its own kind of statement, 3 years of silence collapsing into a single expression across a conference table. David laid it out in order. The bylaw provision protecting board observer status, violated the moment Gary ordered a termination without review. The recording of Gary instructing the destruction of 2 years of safety files that included the original written warnings filed by Laura Dawson before her death. The altered dates on the Warehouse 3 maintenance logs, the ones Emily had first noticed weeks earlier and hadn't been able to name until now. And for the record, David said, closing the folder, Mr. Pruitt's approval authority and system access were suspended by emergency trustee action at 2:49 in the afternoon, the same day he ordered Ryan Dawson's termination. 35 minutes after that termination went into effect. He has been operating without actual authority for the better part of 2 weeks and did not know it. The room was quiet enough to hear the air conditioning cycle on. Gary opened his mouth once, found nothing useful to put in it, and closed it again. One of the older board members, a woman named Carol who'd sat on Prescott's board since before Ryan was born, leaned forward and asked the only question that mattered. "Mr. Pruitt. Did you order the destruction of those safety files, yes or no?" "Those files were archived per standard retention policy," Gary said. "That's not what the recording says." Gary didn't answer that one at all. He looked instead toward the window, toward the parking lot 9 floors down, as if there were somewhere else he could be standing in the next 30 seconds if he only wanted it badly enough. The vote, when it came, wasn't close. Termination for cause, effective retroactively to the moment his authority had already lapsed, the board's language making it official what David's emergency order had already made true in fact. Security walked Gary out within the hour, his badge deactivated before he'd finished clearing his desk. Emily had been asked to attend, and she sat through the entire proceeding with her hands folded tightly in her lap, half expecting to be named alongside Gary for the file she'd signed 2 weeks earlier. Instead, David turned to her near the end and said, plainly, that her termination order for Ryan Dawson was void, that her own conduct throughout, questioning the order, pursuing the altered records, refusing to look away once she'd found something wrong, would be entered into the record as exactly the kind of judgment Prescott needed more of, not less. Ryan crossed the room afterward, past board members already gathering their things, and stopped in front of her. Up close, in that room, he didn't look like a maintenance technician or a silent shareholder. He just looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for 3 years and had, for the first time, set part of it down. 35 minutes, Emily said quietly. That's how long it took. 3 years, Ryan said. That's how long it took me to make the call. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Something had shifted in the space between them, unspoken, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself with words so much as with the simple fact of two people no longer looking away from each other. Ryan brought Emily home 3 evenings later, and he was careful to say, standing on his own porch, that it wasn't a date, exactly, more that Grace had asked twice already when the lady with the nice voice was coming back, and he figured a 9-year-old's opinion carried more weight than most. Grace met Emily at the door with a drawing already in hand, 3 stick figures under a lopsided sun, one tall, one shorter, one small with pigtails drawn as careful loops. "That's you, that's Dad, that's me," Grace explained, matter of fact, like she was reading off a grocery list. There was a 4th figure faintly sketched near the edge, half erased. Grace didn't explain that one, and Emily didn't ask. Dinner was simple, spaghetti, garlic bread slightly burnt on one side, Grace narrating a long and complicated story about a classroom hamster that had escaped its cage. Emily found herself laughing more than she expected to, the kind of laugh that arrived without her deciding to let it. "Dad doesn't laugh like that," Grace observed, watching Emily with the same frank attention she gave most things. "He does the quiet one. Where his shoulders go up and down but no sound comes out." "I do laugh," Ryan said. "You do the quiet one," Grace repeated, unmoved, and went back to her spaghetti as though the matter were settled. Ryan caught Emily's eye across the table, something almost sheepish in it, and for once didn't argue with his daughter's assessment. After dinner Grace insisted on showing Emily her room, the walls covered in drawings taped up without much order, horses and rocket ships and one careful sketch of a woman with dark hair that Grace didn't name and Emily didn't ask about. Ryan stood in the doorway watching the two of them talk, saying nothing, letting the moment be exactly what it was without trying to shape it into anything bigger. Later, word moved through Prescott's internal channels that the full investigative file on Gary Pruitt, the financial discrepancies going back 4 years, the buried safety reports, the falsified maintenance logs, had been handed over to federal investigators for review. Nobody on the warehouse floor cheered exactly, but there was a lightness in the building the next morning that hadn't been there in longer than most employees could remember, the particular relief of watching a threat finally named out loud instead of whispered about in break rooms. Ryan and Emily sat on the back porch after Grace had gone to bed, 2 mugs of coffee cooling between them, the Tulsa night settling quiet around the yard. Neither of them reached for the other. They didn't need to yet. The silence between them had stopped feeling like something to fill and started feeling like something worth sitting inside. "I never told anyone the whole story," Ryan said eventually. "Not even people at work who'd known me for years. Just, Laura went in that morning like any other day. Told me she was finally going to push the compressor issue up the chain, in writing, get it on record so nobody could bury it again. She didn't come home." Emily reached over and set her hand over his, not gripping, just resting there, weight and warmth and nothing more. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," Ryan said. "I know," Emily said. "I don't." That was enough. They sat there a long while, coffee gone cold, saying nothing else, and for the first time in 3 years Ryan didn't feel like the silence in his own house was something he was enduring alone. Prescott named Emily vice president of operations for the full region within the month, and one of her first official acts was overhauling the safety review process from the ground up, independent audits, mandatory written response to every flagged hazard within 72 hours, no exceptions carved out for budget season. She asked Ryan to join as a formal safety and trust advisor, a seat with real authority behind it, no more hiding inside a job title that undersold what he actually was. Ryan turned the title down. He kept the maintenance job instead, the same gray jacket, the same tool belt worn soft at the loops. The only thing that changed was that now everyone on the floor knew exactly who he was, and rather than distance, it drew people closer. A crew that had once seen a quiet man who kept to himself now understood they'd been standing next to someone who'd spent 3 years watching over them without asking for a single thing in return. "You could have told me," Emily said to him once, sitting across from him in his own kitchen. "Any point in the last 4 years, you could have just told me who you were. Would it have mattered? You didn't know me from anyone else on that floor when you signed that form." She thought about that a long moment. "No. I suppose it wouldn't have. Might be the only reason any of this worked the way it did." The first time Ryan walked onto the floor after the news spread, the forklift crew stopped what they were doing and clapped, unplanned and a little embarrassed about it, the way people are when a gesture arrives before they've decided whether it's appropriate. Ryan just nodded, uncomfortable with the attention the way he'd always been, and went back to work. Patricia found him near the compressor room an hour later, wrench still in hand. "For what it's worth," she said, "nobody on this floor is surprised you turned down the office. Just surprised it took this long for the rest of us to find out who'd been covering for us all this time." "Wasn't covering for anybody. Just doing my job." "Sure you were." She smiled and left it there, the way people do when they've decided not to push a point that's already been made. Tony got a formal commendation from the new safety committee, along with a scholarship fund Emily quietly set up out of her own signing bonus, though she made sure nobody put her name on the paperwork. When Ryan found out anyway, he didn't say much about it. He just started leaving the last cup of coffee in the break room pot for Tony most mornings, an old habit reserved for people he'd decided, without announcement, to keep an eye on. Emily and Ryan signed the new safety policy together on a Friday afternoon, standing in the same conference room where Gary had once sat at the head of the table. The document carried an official name at the top, chosen without much discussion, the Laura Dawson Safety Standard. It was Emily's idea. Ryan hadn't been able to say much when she suggested it, just nodded once and looked away until he trusted his voice again. That evening, Grace handed Emily a finished version of the drawing from weeks earlier, 4 figures now, no half-erased edges, everyone fully drawn in, standing under a sun that took up most of the page. "I fixed it," Grace said simply. Emily looked at the drawing a long moment before she answered. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." Ryan watched the two of them from the doorway, saying nothing, filing the moment away the same careful way he filed away everything that mattered. Autumn came to Tulsa the way it always did, slow and gold along the banks of the Arkansas River, cottonwood leaves turning loose and drifting down onto the walking path. Grace ran ahead of them, arms out like an airplane, calling back over her shoulder for them to hurry up. Ryan and Emily walked slower, in no rush, close enough now that their hands brushed once, then again, then simply stayed together without either of them deciding to make it official. 35 minutes, Ryan said, watching Grace crouch to examine something in the grass. That's what people are going to remember, if this ever gets told anywhere. The call, the freeze, the vote. 35 minutes to undo what he tried to do to me. Isn't that the part that matters? It's the part that's easy to point to. He was quiet a moment, watching his daughter turn a leaf over in her hands like it held some kind of secret. But 35 minutes didn't fix anything on its own. It just stopped the bleeding. What actually mattered was 3 years of watching that floor, waiting to see if it would happen to someone else the way it happened to Laura. 3 years of not trusting myself to want anything more than getting through the next day. Emily's hand tightened slightly around his. And now? Now I made a different kind of call, Ryan said. Slower one. Still scared me more than the first. Which call was that? Asking you to come out here today. Asking you to stay for dinner after. Small things. They shouldn't scare a grown man half as much as they do. I'm glad they do, Emily said. Means you still care whether the answer's yes. She smiled, looking out at the river instead of at him, giving him the privacy people sometimes need even inside their own honesty. I'm not sorry I signed that paper, she said. I know that sounds strange. But if I hadn't, I never would have found out who was actually standing on the other side of that door. Grace called back to them from further up the path, holding up something she'd found half buried near the roots of an old cottonwood, a smooth gray stone, unremarkable except that she'd decided it wasn't. Can we keep this one? Depends what it's for, Ryan called back. Everything, Grace said, like that answered the question completely, and ran back to them, breathless, reaching up with her free hand to take Emily's, so that for a moment all three of them stood connected in a line along the riverbank, nobody letting go. 35 minutes had been enough to reverse a decision. 3 years of silence had been the part that actually needed undoing, and it took a lot longer than 35 minutes for a man to learn how to trust someone with what was left of his heart, but standing there in the gold light with his daughter's hand in one of his and Emily's in the other, Ryan Dawson finally understood that some things, once they start moving, cannot be stopped by anyone at all.